In the quiet coastal town of Ashbury, Maine, during the late autumn of 1987, a particular story unfolded. It was a story of quiet echoes and profound remembrance, one that perhaps only a close witness, someone standing just near enough to hear the faint rustle of old paper, could truly tell. That story, held in the stillness of a small house by the sea, deserves to be shared with the world. Its true beginning was not with a word, but with a sound. The first sound of that particular morning was the kettle. A low, tired whistle rose through the dark kitchen, a sound like breath being drawn through an old wound. The clock read 4:42 a.m. This was the hour when the world remained more shadow than solid shape, a time when only the truly faithful or the deeply haunted were awake by conscious choice. Evelyn Holt sat patiently at her simple kitchen table, wrapped in a familiar wool shawl that had grown thin and worn at the elbows over many years. Her hands, knotted with age but entirely sure in their purpose, waited for the kettle to finish its call. The rising steam began to fog the cold window pane behind her, obscuring a view where dawn was still just a distant idea rather than a tangible light. Beside her sat an old leather-bound journal. Its outer edges were curled from decades of handling and devotion. The pages within had yellowed, becoming as soft and pliant as old fabric. A simple pen rested across the cover, lying still like a musician's instrument between songs. The cover bore a faint embossing that read, "Evac Hospital 14, 1944. Evelyn no longer needed to look at that faded date. She had long ago memorized the profound weight of it. It marked the year she first began her solemn task of writing the names. The kettle finally hissed to a boil, and she rose to pour the water. The mug she used bore the fine cracks of long and faithful service, its handle showing a thin, silvery line of mended solder. She carried the steaming cup to the table, then sat down once more, lowering herself carefully into the chair as her knees clicked in quiet, familiar protest. Outside the small house, the cold world was waiting patiently for the sun to arrive. Inside, in the warmth of the kitchen, it felt as if the room itself was waiting for her to begin. With a steady hand, she opened the journal. The silence of the room seemed to fill with the presence of the names written on page after page. Every single line was penned in her precise, slanted hand. Michael D. Kearns from the 1st Infantry due to pneumonia. Robert, known as Bobby, Lyle of the 7th Armored from leg amputation and shock. Simon Ortega of the 83rd from an excess of medication in the field. The list continued, hundreds of names, perhaps even more. Each name carried a small annotation, perhaps a time, or sometimes just a single, simple word. Some sang, some smiled, some prayed, some asked for their mother. This was her unbreakable ritual, her most solemn promise. It was a promise she had made in an entirely different world, long ago, under a torn canvas roof in France, when the air was perpetually thick with the smells of iodine and smoke. Every single year since the war had finally ended, Evelyn rose before the dawn on November 11th. She brewed her tea and she wrote the names. She was not writing all of them at once, as she had finished that monumental task long ago. Instead, she transcribed one full page for remembrance, always timing her work to finish at sunrise. It was a sacred promise, kept to the countless young men who had not made it home. Directly above her, in the ceiling of the kitchen, a floorboard creaked softly. Her granddaughter, Lucy, a girl of 12 years and full of bright questions that did not always have simple answers, stirred in the bedroom just above. Evelyn paused her hand mid-letter, the very tip of her pen suspended just above the paper. A faint smile touched her lips, and then she continued writing. The pen scratched softly as it moved across the aged paper. The sound it made was deliberate, almost reverent. Each stroke of ink felt like the steady, unfaltering rhythm of a heart that refused to stop beating. A single candle flickered on the table beside her. Its gentle light made the fresh ink gleam wetly for a moment before it dried into the page. The names there on the paper seemed to shimmer for just a second, as if they were alive again. Lucy padded quietly down the wooden stairs, enveloped in an oversized sweatshirt, rubbing the lingering sleep from her eyes. She whispered her grandmother's name into the quiet. Evelyn did not look up from her work, but answered calmly, letting her know she was in the kitchen. Lucy's footsteps were soft on the floor, uncertain, as if she felt she was crossing onto sacred ground. Her eyes took in the scene, the candle, the open journal, the act of writing. Evelyn commented on her being up so early, her voice low but perfectly clear. Lucy explained that she had heard the kettle. Evelyn called the kettle a traitor, and she smiled at her own remark, just a brief flicker of humor. Lucy's gaze drifted down to the open journal. She asked if those were names she was writing. Evelyn confirmed that they were. Lucy frowned, pressing to know whose names they were. Evelyn explained they were men she once knew, and some she did not. Her hand stopped its movement on the pen. She added that all of them had passed through her hands. Lucy tilted her head, trying to understand, and asked if they were like her patients. Evelyn gave a single, slow nod. The girl then asked why she wrote them every single year. Evelyn paused for a moment, not because she lacked the answer, but because some truths are simply too heavy to hand over to a child all at once. She finally said it was to remember. It was also to make absolutely sure that someone, somewhere, still said their names out loud. Lucy looked from the flickering candlelight to the inked lines glinting on the page like small black rivers. She asked her grandmother if she had promised them. Evelyn confirmed that she had. Lucy asked the simple question of why. Evelyn met the girl's eyes directly. The blue in her own irises had faded with time, but their clarity had not. She explained it was because she was the very last person that most of them saw. A sudden gust of wind pressed against the kitchen window, rattling the old latch. Outside, the dark horizon was finally beginning to pale. A thin thread of rose-colored light started spilling over the tops of the distant pines. Evelyn turned her head toward it. It was almost time for the sun. She slid the heavy journal closer and found the next blank page. Her hand trembled, just faintly, as she wrote the date in small, even letters, noting November 11th, 1987, at dawn. The small candle flame leaned in the air, moving with her breath. Then she began the list once more. Corporal Thomas Avery of the 82nd Airborne from a chest wound in Normandy. The pen scratched out its quiet music, filling the deep silence. Private Leo Hart of the 5th Infantry from shrapnel near Rouen. She whispered each name aloud as she wrote it, each one a quiet benediction. Lucy came to stand directly beside her chair, no longer asking questions, just watching. The girl's small reflection joined her grandmother's in the glass of the window. There were two faces, one old and lined, one young and smooth, both of them framed by the arriving morning light. When the sun finally breached the horizon, it spilled brilliant gold light across the open page, illuminating the dark ink until it seemed fully alive again. Evelyn set the pen down carefully and closed her eyes. The candle flame flickered one last time and went out on its own, its smoke rising in a thin spiral like a prayer. For a long moment, she simply listened to the creak of the house, the hum of the kettle cooling, and the faraway call of gulls over the harbor. Then, barely above a whisper, she said aloud, "All right, boys, the sun is up." Outside, the first light of Veterans Day touched the frost on the lawn, making every single blade of grass shimmer. Lucy watched the steam curl from her grandmother's mug and thought the word for what she was seeing might be honor, though she did not truly know it yet. Evelyn reached over and rested her aged hand on the girl's. She said that someday she would tell her each of their stories, but not all at once. She explained that you have to earn the right to remember. The pen rolled to a stop on the table. The journal stayed open, the ink drying in the new light. And for the first time, Evelyn's reflection in the window looked at peace. The air, she remembered, was always the color of smoke and iodine. Canvas tents stretched in long, muddy rows along the ridge outside St. Lo. Their canvas flaps snapped loudly in the wind, sounding like thin lungs struggling just to breathe. The mud in the camp swallowed boots whole. The rain had been falling for 3 straight days, but without real conviction, just enough to soak everything, never enough to cleanse the air. Inside the tent designated Ward C, the wounded men arrived faster than they could possibly be logged. Evelyn Holt, then just 23, and a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, wore her fatigue jacket open at the throat. Its collar was stained dark with perspiration and grime. Her hands never, ever stopped moving. She was always cutting bandages, administering relief for pain, checking pulses, and closing eyes. The combined smell of ether, blood, and stale coffee hung in the air, so thick it felt you could taste it. A voice shouted from the tent's entrance, calling for the next one. The litter bearers appeared through the flap. One was a man with half his shirt missing. The other was visibly dragging his own injured leg as he carried the stretcher's front end. On the cot lay a boy barely older than 16, his lips the pale color of slate, his dog tags clinking with each labored step. The corpsman reported it was shrapnel to the abdomen, his voice gone entirely mechanical. He started to say they could not, that the boy was fading fast. Evelyn ordered them to table 3, quickly moving aside a tray of instruments. Her gloved hands trembled for only a second, then steadied with purpose. They worked mostly in silence, surrounded only by the raw sounds of field surgery. There were scissors biting through thick fabric, the wet hiss of suction, and the low, persistent moan of someone trying desperately not to die. The boy's eyes suddenly fluttered open. They were a pale gray color and completely unfocused. Evelyn leaned close and asked for his name. He did not seem to hear her and did not answer. She repeated the question, her voice firmer, asking for his name, soldier. His lips moved, forming the name. He managed to say Tommy, and then Avery. Her own pulse stilled for half a second. It was the name that, so many years later, she would always write first every Veterans Day. She spoke his name, Tommy, softly. She told him he was safe now, that he was in good hands. He blinked up at her, appearing dazed, and asked if they had taken the ridge. Evelyn glanced toward the flap of the tent, where distant artillery still echoed miles away, a low and endless thunder. She told him yes, they had. She lied, because that was the true language of mercy. He smiled faintly at her words, then arched once beneath her hands, and then he went completely still. The nearby monitor gave a single weak buzz, and then faded to silence. Evelyn exhaled slowly through her teeth. She reached for the clipboard to log the death, but the small pencil attached had already broken from overuse. She grabbed another, scrawled the time and the unit, the 82nd Airborne, and then she hesitated at the line labeled next of kin. There was no name to write, no address, just the word unknown. She looked down at the metal tag around his neck. The chain holding it was snapped clean in two. Only one half of it remained. Her partner, working across the table, a dark-eyed nurse named Marian O'Connell, saw her pause. Marian told her to write it anyway, assuring her some clerk would sort it out later. Evelyn did not move. She stated firmly that he had told her his name. Marian replied, "That was good," her voice heavy with fatigue, and said, "That was enough." But for Evelyn, it was not enough. Later that night, long after the last light in the tent had dimmed and the exhausted orderlies slept where they fell, Evelyn sat under the weak yellow glow of a single lantern. The persistent rain had finally eased into a cold mist. Somewhere far off, the front line still murmured its deadly song. She opened a small, battered notebook she always carried in her uniform pocket. It was the one she normally used for medication counts and shift notes. She flipped all the way to the very last page. There, squeezed between her dosage tallies and some rough sketches of bandage layouts, she wrote a new entry. Corporal Thomas Avery of the 82nd Airborne, from abdominal shrapnel, who died July 17, 1944. Then, after a long, reflective pause, she added a final note. He smiled when I lied. By the time dawn broke, she had written 5 more names. Marian found her hunched over the small notebook, her pen still moving across the paper. Marian warned her, calling her Ev, that she would drive herself mad. Evelyn replied that maybe she would, but she asked who would write them if she did not. Marian sat down heavily beside her, rubbing her tired eyes. She insisted the records people at headquarters would handle it, that it was not their burden to carry. Evelyn slowly shook her head. She stated that headquarters does not see their faces. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant, grinding rumble of trucks bringing still more stretchers. Marian watched her friend for a long moment, then nodded once in understanding. She told Evelyn to keep the book then, but she added a warning not to forget the living while she was so busy tending to the dead. Evelyn gave her a small, weary smile. She replied that they were all part of the very same duty. The days that followed blurred together into one long, sleepless, continuous motion. Essential supplies ran desperately low. The medics, once full of gallows humor, joked far less. The chaplain's voice grew hoarse from reading so many psalms. One grim morning, a transport convoy arrived with more wounded men than they had space to lay them. Men were bleeding out on stretchers in the mud, while others were triaged for the few miracles they could perform. Evelyn worked without a single pause, her mind reduced to a rhythm of numbers, compressions, and whispered prayers. Then came the terrible sound that froze everyone in place. It was a splutter, a high-pitched whine, and then the unmistakable, terrifying whistle of incoming fire. Marion screamed for everyone to get down. The shell impacted just 50 yards from the ward. The entire tent shuddered violently, the hanging lantern swung wildly, and the world became a blinding rain of dust and torn canvas. Evelyn threw herself protectively over the nearest patient, a move born of pure instinct, not conscious thought. When the deafening echo finally cleared, half the tent was simply gone. Acrid smoke bled through the massive gash where the roof had been. Someone screamed, a sound of pure agony. It was a medic pinned under the fallen central pole. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, ripping her gloves on the sharp debris. She pulled at the heavy, torn canvas until her hands were raw. Marion crawled beside her through the wreckage, coughing, her dark hair matted with thick mud. They found the trapped medic. It was Private Leo Hart, only 19 years old, his freckles almost invisible beneath a layer of soot. His leg was twisted at an awful angle, but his grip on Evelyn's sleeve was fierce. He rasped at her, pleading with her not to leave him. She assured him he was not alone, her hands already pressing gauze to the worst of the wound. He tried to form a smile, but failed. He asked her to tell his mom, to please tell her that he was not scared. Evelyn swallowed hard against the lump in her throat and promised him she would. She never did. It was because she was never able to find an address for him. After he was gone, she wrote his name in the book too. Private Leo Hart of the 5th Infantry, from the shelling at St. Lo, who died July 19, 1944. She added a note that he had asked not to be forgotten. The ink bled through the thin page just as the rain began to fall again. The weeks passed into months. The war rolled steadily east, leaving behind the countless ghosts that always ride in the wake of victory. Evelyn's small notebook thickened with entries. Names upon names filled its pages. When it was completely full, she started a new one, labeling its cover in small, neat letters as Field Journal 2. She tried to tell herself it was merely for the official record, but in her heart she knew it was an act of personal defiance. It was her quiet rebellion against oblivion. One evening, the Red Cross chaplain, a soft-spoken man named Father Duval, whose face was gray with fatigue, stopped by her cot. He sat down and observed that she kept those books very close. She confirmed that she did, addressing him as Father. He gently asked if he might know the reason why. She hesitated for a moment. She explained it was because every one of them had someone back home who had promised to remember, and she feared most of those someones were now gone too. He studied her face intently. Then he asked a simple question. Who remembers you? Evelyn had no answer for him. Duval smiled a sad, knowing smile. He advised her to make sure someone would. He told her not to keep that heavy burden all alone. She looked down at the journal resting in her lap, its pages feeling heavy with all the names that no longer had voices. She promised him she would not, though at that specific time she did not yet know how true that promise would one day become. Outside the tent, The first real sun of August broke through the oppressive clouds, staining the drab canvas tents a brilliant gold for the first time in months. For just a moment, everything looked almost beautiful again. Evelyn watched that golden light fall across her open notebook. She lifted her pen and drew a thin, straight line beneath the last entry. She whispered the words that would one day come to guide her life. Remember them, and you will remember yourself. The war officially ended on a Wednesday, or at least that is when the newspapers said that it did. For Evelyn Holt, the profound, sudden silence that followed felt immensely heavier than the shelling ever had. She stepped off the massive troop ship at Pier 86 in New York Harbor, carrying only one duffel bag and her 3 precious notebooks, which were secured in her coat. The duffel bag carried her uniform and her medals. The notebooks carried everything else. They held the names, the dates, and all the quiet debts she had not yet finished paying. Vast crowds lined the pier, waving countless flags and handkerchiefs, cheering loudly at the soldiers as they passed. No one seemed to cheer for the nurses. That was fine with Evelyn. They had been mostly invisible before, and they could be invisible once again. Evelyn managed a polite smile when a pushy reporter asked to take her photograph. He wanted her to hold her service medal up high near her chin, as if it were a trophy. She quietly but firmly refused. She explained that the brave ones were the others, tapping the coat pocket where the journals rested securely. She said that she had just stayed busy. She made the decision to move back to her home in Maine primarily because it was quiet there. It was, in fact, too quiet at first. Her mother's old house smelled of cedar wood and mothballs. The sea nearby was gray and unsettlingly calm, seemingly unwilling to echo the turmoil still inside her. At night, she would hear the field hospital in her dreams. She heard the sharp slap of the canvas tent flaps, the heavy thump of muddy boots, and the awful wet rasp of a dying breath. She would wake suddenly before dawn, slick with a cold sweat, and she would sit by her window until the distant horizon finally turned pink. That was the time when she began writing the names all over again. It was not as a duty this time. It was purely as an act of remembrance. Each year on November 11th, well before the sun broke the dark, she opened the first journal. She laid out a single candle, and she copied one full page of names into a new, clean book marked simply Veterans Day. This solemn ritual steadied her hands when nothing else in the world could. She never told anyone about what she was doing. The town and the men who had returned had all moved on. It was not something that she felt she could explain. It was simply something that had to be done. The years fell away, one after another, like pages turning in a book. She eventually married a local shipbuilder named Daniel Holt. He was a kind and unhurried man, the type of man who built things that were meant to last. He never once asked her about the journals. He did find her once, early in their marriage, at the kitchen table with the candle burning low, writing in the gray half-light. He had asked her gently if she could not sleep. She had replied only that she was just keeping her promises. He simply nodded, kissed the top of her head, and he let her keep her private mysteries. Together, they built a good, small life. They had a house by the harbor, a daughter they named Margaret, and the steady, comforting rhythm of work and changing seasons. But Evelyn always carried the war with her like a second heartbeat. It was quiet, it was constant, and it was invisible unless you listened very, very close. In the year 1953, the second field journal began to fall apart. Its old spine cracked down the middle. The fragile pages threatened to scatter. Evelyn spent an entire afternoon at her kitchen table, carefully threading a new, strong binding through the original holes with a sewing needle. Her daughter Margaret, then 8 years old and endlessly curious, watched her mother from the corner of the room. She asked if that was her diary. Evelyn replied it was something like that. The girl asked what she wrote in it. Evelyn answered with the single word, names. Margaret wanted to know, names of who? Evelyn told her they were people she knew a very long time ago. Margaret asked if they were like friends. Evelyn paused, considering the word, and then said they were closer than that. The girl frowned in thought. She asked if Evelyn missed them. Evelyn answered quietly that she missed them every single day. After Daniel's passing in 1967, Evelyn found herself alone once again with the profound silence. But by that time, the pre-dawn ritual had become something much larger than memory. It had become her purpose. The notebooks were her personal map through the passing years. Each page she wrote was a quiet conversation she refused to let die. By the year 1971, she had completely filled 5 large volumes. The original ink had faded from black to a soft brown. Her handwriting was slower now, but it remained just as precise. Her eyes had weakened and her hands often stiffened. Still, she always woke before the dawn each Veterans Day. Her neighbors sometimes noticed the single candlelight in her kitchen window. They referred to her as the quiet nurse on Willow Street. No one knew the true reason for the candle. Some neighbors said she was praying for her late husband. Others thought she was simply lonely. Evelyn let them all believe whatever version comforted them the most. Then came the unforgettable year of the Great Storm in 1979. A massive nor'easter rolled in hard off the coast, both brutal and sudden in its arrival. The sea tore through the harbor road, snapping fences like twigs and flooding all the basements. Evelyn's small house trembled under the force of the wind. When the electricity inevitably failed, she calmly lit her candle and sat by the window, just as always. The precious journals were stacked neatly on the table before her. The flood water rose up to the porch steps. The candle flame guttered in the drafts. Still, she continued to write. When rescuers finally arrived the next morning, they found her perfectly calm, dry only to the knee, with her pen still in her hand. The journals had been carefully wrapped in wax canvas and secured with heavy twine. They were completely untouched by the water. The local fire chief asked her why in the world she had stayed. She looked past him, out toward the gray horizon. She explained simply that they had waited for her once. Now it was her turn to wait. By the time her granddaughter Lucy was born in 1975, Evelyn was already a quiet legend within her own family. She was known as the nurse who never talked about the war, the one who still rose in the dark each November to write her letters to the dawn. Her daughter Margaret tried to ask her about it, just once. She asked her mother why she kept doing this, insisting that she did not have to relive it. Evelyn had smiled at her, a tired but resolute expression. She explained that it was not reliving. It was, she said, remembering. In 1987, the year Lucy first found her by the window, the ritual had grown quieter but somehow even deeper. Evelyn no longer wrote out full pages of names. She now wrote just a few names, always keeping them in order. But on that particular Veterans Day, something was different. Something changed. Halfway through writing a name, Her pen faltered. Her hand suddenly trembled too much for her to finish the word. The ink spread out, forming a small, uncertain blot on the page. For the very first time in more than 40 years, she could not complete her list. She stared down at the unfinished line of text. It read, Staff Sergeant Harold Price, and then nothing. The candle flame beside her flickered, as if in sympathy. She set the pen down on the table and pressed her warm palm flat against the page, as if that warmth alone could make up for the missing words. Outside, the sky continued to lighten, turning pale and then gold. Her reflection gazing back from the window pane was blurred with sudden tears. She whispered to the room that she was getting old, addressing the boys. Then, in an almost apologetic tone, she added that they would have to help her remember next year. It was then that Lucy stirred in the room upstairs. The small sound drew Evelyn back to the present. When her granddaughter appeared in the doorway, sleepy-eyed and barefoot, Evelyn suddenly realized this might be the very moment Father Duval had spoken of so long ago. This might be the time to finally share the burden. She reached out her trembling hand, steadying the girl's small hand with her own, and carefully guided it down toward the open journal. She spoke softly, telling her to write this next one for her. Lucy hesitated, uncertain, and asked what she was supposed to write. Evelyn told her to write just the name. And so, in a child's uncertain, uneven letters, Lucy wrote the name Harold Price. Evelyn smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile that belongs only to people who have spent a lifetime keeping impossible promises. She said there, it was done. Now she told Lucy, you have met him too. The pen rolled slowly to a rest on the table, lying between them, physically bridging the wide space between the past and the present. Outside, the full sunrise had finally reached the window pane. The brilliant light cut sharply through the thin candle smoke, looking just like a benediction. Evelyn closed her eyes. The entire house was still. In that profound silence, the old nurse, who had spent more than half her lifetime trying so hard to remember, felt something inside her shift. For the very first time since the war had ended, she was no longer the only one carrying the names. The morning came colder than usual. It was November 11th, 1991. A delicate frost crawled along the edges of the kitchen window, looking like intricate lace spun from frozen breath. Evelyn Holt woke, as always, before the alarm. The habit itself was older than her conscious memory. Her frail body protested the movement. Her joints were aching, and her lungs felt stiff from the damp night air. But she moved just as she always had. Slow, certain, and purposeful. She filled the old kettle, lit the gas burner, and waited for that deeply familiar sigh of rising steam. The house creaked quietly around her. The sea, just beyond the dark pines, murmured in its low, constant rhythm. This would be her 47th Veterans Day sitting at this very table. The candle waited on the table, now half burned, just a small stub remaining in a saucer. The journal beside it had grown impressively thick with all the additions. Her handwriting had been shrinking year by year, as if to make room for just one more name, one more small note, one more promise kept. But this year, she found her hands shook far too much to hold the pen steady. She made the effort anyway. The first letter she wrote came out crooked. The second one bled into the soft paper. By the third attempt, she stopped pretending. She set the pen down, folded her shaking hands in her lap, and simply let the silence of the room come. Then, welcome footsteps sounded on the stairs. Lucy, now 18 years old and home from her first semester of college, appeared at the doorway. Her hair was messy from sleep, and she was wrapped in her father's old flannel shirt. She smiled when she saw the scene, which was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. There was the candle, the notebook, and the dawn just outside, still deciding whether to rise. She spoke softly, observing that her grandmother had started without her. Evelyn looked up at her, her eyes pale and watery, the kind of faded blue that seems to forget its own edges. She admitted that she had tried, but she had not gotten very far. Lucy came closer into the room, pulled up another chair, and reached for the pen. She said that they would just do it together then. Evelyn's mouth curved into a smile, faint but sure. She asked Lucy if she remembered how. Lucy confirmed she remembered every line, the name, the unit, the cause, and the note. She opened the large journal to the next waiting blank page. The paper itself seemed to tremble beneath her touch. It was so thin and soft, like a sigh. Evelyn whispered for her to date it. Lucy wrote carefully at the top, noting November 11th, 1991, at dawn. The single candle flame flickered on the table between them. Evelyn spoke the first name aloud. Lucy wrote it down. Then Evelyn spoke another, and Lucy wrote another. The pen's steady sound filled the quiet kitchen. It was the very same rhythm Evelyn had once known so well in the field tents of France, a pattern of scratch, pause, whisper, and breath. Halfway down the newly filled page, Evelyn's voice suddenly broke. She looked past Lucy, out the window, toward the horizon where the first faint blush of sunlight was just touching the water. She said that she used to think this ritual was all about them, about the men, about the war itself, but it was not. Lucy looked up from her writing and asked what it was about then. Evelyn murmured that it was about remembrance, and, she added, it was about forgiveness. Lucy asked if she meant forgiveness for them. Evelyn answered no, it was forgiveness for herself. She exhaled a long breath, her eyes suddenly wet. She explained that when you spend enough nights holding dying hands, you inevitably start wondering why your own hands keep on living. Writing their names, she confessed, was how she finally made peace with the fact of her own surviving. Outside the window, the morning light grew stronger. A warm gold began edging into the kitchen, finding the worn lines of the table, the soft folds of Evelyn's shawl, and the wisp of steam from the mug that had now gone cold. Lucy hesitated over the next name on the old list. She asked her grandmother who was next. Evelyn smiled. She said it did not matter. She told Lucy to pick one from the very beginning. Lucy carefully flipped back to the very first page. The ink there had faded significantly, but the early handwriting was steady and strong. She traced the top line with her finger. It read, Corporal Thomas Avery. She looked back at her grandmother and asked if she meant this one. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes soft with deep recognition. She confirmed he was the very first one. She said she wrote his name by lantern light while the ground itself was still shaking. She paused, then added that he had smiled when she lied. Lucy asked what she meant by that. Evelyn explained that she had told him they took the ridge. He wanted to die believing that it all mattered, so she gave him that. She told Lucy that you will find a lot of hard truth in a war, but mercy is often the harder thing to tell. Lucy's throat tightened with emotion. She reassured her grandmother that she did what she had to do. Evelyn corrected her, saying she did what she could. Her voice came out thin, but it was resolute. And that, she said, is all anyone ever does, especially when the world breaks apart. The kettle on the stove whistled at that very moment, a sound that was startlingly bright in the quiet room. Lucy rose from her chair to pour the tea, but when she turned back, she saw that Evelyn's hands had fallen completely still in her lap. Her grandmother was sitting very straight in her chair, her gaze fixed intently on the sunrise, her lips parted in a faint, peaceful half-smile. The candle's flame beside her suddenly fluttered low. Lucy whispered her name, Gran, in the sudden stillness. There was no answer. The kettle's whistle faded away. The only sound left in the room was the pin, which was still rolling gently on the tabletop, tracing tiny little arcs until it finally stopped beside the open journal. Lucy's own hands were shaking as she reached out for her grandmother's wrist. It was cool to the touch, peaceful and profoundly still. The sun broke fully and gloriously over the horizon. Bright light filled the entire room, catching on the silver of Evelyn's hair, the wet sheen of the ink, and the thin line of smoke from the candle that was curling upward like a departing breath. For a very long moment, Lucy just sat there in the golden glow, her own heart beating loud and heavy against the sudden deep hush. Then, slowly and deliberately, she took up the pen and she finished the line that her grandmother had started. Thomas Avery, remembered. Outside the window, the wind carried the fresh scent of salt and pine. Seagulls wheeled and turned high above the harbor, their cries sharp and fleeting on the air. Inside the kitchen, the candle burned down to its last inch of wax, its flame suddenly steady and unwavering. Lucy gently closed the journal, her thumb resting on the deep indent of Evelyn's familiar handwriting on the cover. She whispered to the empty room that she would keep them safe. She made that promise. Her own reflection looking back from the window looked older in the new light. It looked like a continuation, not merely a copy. The pen lay still between her fingers, still warm from use, feeling much the way a torch must feel when it is passed on. She did not cry right away, not just yet. She just watched the beautiful sunrise, the same one her grandmother had waited for every year. And she felt, for the very first time, what Evelyn must have felt all along. She understood that remembering is not about holding on to grief. It is about refusing to let those memories vanish. The very first Veterans Day after Evelyn Holt's passing was strange and hollow without her. The house felt far too still, as if the air itself was waiting for a familiar cue that never came. Lucy stood in the kitchen doorway at exactly 4:42 a.m. It was the precise minute her grandmother always used to rise. The kitchen smelled faintly of settled dust and old candle wax. Outside, a thick frost silvered the garden beds, and the sea beyond the pines was just a dark, cold smear on the horizon. She had moved back into the old house that fall. She had been sorting through Evelyn's belongings slowly and very carefully, never doing it all in one sitting. Opening each drawer felt like starting a conversation she was not yet ready to end. The journals were now stacked safely in a wooden chest by the window. There were 7 volumes in total. Their bindings were frayed, their pages had become soft, and the ink on them was fading to the color of old tea. Lucy had meticulously cleaned the table, replaced the small candle, and set the first main notebook open. It was open to the page where the handwriting visibly changed, from Evelyn's elegant slanted script to her own uneven younger lines. Thomas Avery. Remembered. That single word, remembered, was hers. It was the last word her grandmother had ever heard. The old kettle seemed to take longer to boil now that the house's pipes had aged. Lucy smiled at the thought of Evelyn's impatient sigh if she could see it. Then she filled the same old mug, the one with the silvery soldered handle, and carried it to the table. Outside the window, a pale gray light just began to brush the dark horizon. She lit the new candle. The flame bloomed, at first small and uncertain, but then it found its steady shape. She murmured to the quiet room, "All right, Gran, let's do this right." Her own handwriting had changed significantly since that last morning together. It was neater now, much steadier, but still recognizably hers. She wrote the date at the top of the page, November 11th, 1992, at dawn. The small flame leaned slightly toward the fresh ink. She hesitated for a second, her pen poised above the paper. The endless list of names stretched out behind her, back across so many decades. Every single one had been written by a woman who steadfastly refused to let them fade. Lucy flipped carefully through some of the earlier volumes. They smelled faintly of smoke, iodine, sea salt, and of time itself. She read the little notes, the small human details her grandmother had added in the margins. One hummed Blue Moon. Another asked for peaches. One told a joke just as he went under, and Evelyn had added that she never forgot the punchline. Another looked just like her brother when he slept. They were tiny, precious fragments of humanity, all saved from the abyss. The old clock ticked softly on the kitchen wall. Lucy looked out the window, where the dawn had finally begun to bloom in shades of pink over the harbor. She thought about all the things her grandmother had told her, about the war, the names, and the nature of mercy. And suddenly, she completely understood. Evelyn's long ritual had never truly been about mourning. It had been about stewardship. It was memory as a form of inheritance. Lucy picked up the pen and wrote in a clean, strong hand. Staff Sergeant Harold Price of the 101 Airborne, who died in 1944 in France. Then, directly beneath it, she added a new line. Carried forward by Lucy Holt, 1992. She set the pen down, exhaled a long breath, and let the morning silence fill in the rest. Many years later, when Lucy would tell her own daughter about that particular morning, she would always describe the light first. She would explain how it hit the frost, making it glitter like 1,000 small mirrors, and how the candle flame seemed to glow twice as bright once the sun finally appeared. She would explain to her that remembrance is not just a single act, but a posture. It is a way of facing the world with your eyes wide open. She would teach her daughter, too, that promises, the real ones, do not end when the people who first made them do. They simply find new hands to carry them. As the sun finally cleared the distant horizon, Lucy closed the journal, her thumb resting thoughtfully on its worn leather edge. The old house creaked softly in the new warming light. The sea outside answered in its ancient rhythm. She whispered the words, "Good morning, Gran," and the words felt like they were both a greeting and a prayer. Then she leaned forward and blew out the candle. The smoke rose in a thin, graceful spiral, catching the new sunlight as it climbed. It was just as it had every single year before, when Evelyn herself had sat in that very same chair. The line of smoky light lingered in the air for a moment, long after the flame itself was gone. And so the ritual continued, quietly, faithfully, one name at a time. Not for war, not for glory, but for the sacred, enduring act of remembering.